It started with a cry and ended with an army. 80-year-old Franklin "Frank" Moore, a blind veteran, was simply trying to cross the street with his loyal service dog, Duke. The signal chirped, indicating it was safe, and Frank tapped his white cane with practiced confidence. But just halfway through the intersection, chaos struck. Two young officers, new to the force, high on adrenaline and low on awareness, saw only... What they didn't know was that Frank wasn't just another pedestrian. He was a decorated Army veteran who had lost his sight while serving in a disease-ridden combat zone decades ago. And more importantly, someone nearby knew exactly who to call. Within 7 minutes, the intersection was no longer under police control. It was under the command of General Thomas Avery, a 4-star Army leader who'd served with Frank on a classified mission years earlier. Military Humvees rolled in, streets shut down, and the responsible officers found themselves face to face with a wall of consequences they never saw coming. Because some people might not see the whole world, but the world still sees them, and it listens when the right people speak. Franklin "Frank" Moore had seen war, lost his vision in the jungle, and returned home to a country he served quietly for decades. But nothing prepared him for what happened that day at the corner of Elm and 3rd. It starts like any other Tuesday. Frank, now 80, blind since his early 40s due to a rare infection contracted during a combat deployment, was walking with his service dog, Duke. His destination, the local library, where he volunteered weekly to read audiobooks to children. As he and Duke stepped into the crosswalk, the audible pedestrian signal chirped, but just halfway through, confusion struck. Two young officers, barely a year on the job, spotted him crossing and mistook his pace and presence as a disruption. They didn't recognize the white cane or the trained guide dog. "Move it!" barked one officer over the cruiser's loudspeaker. Disoriented by the sudden sound, Frank stumbled. Duke paused, sensing danger. Then came the second command, harsher, crueler, and within seconds, Officer Miller exited the vehicle, shouted an unclear warning, and fired his taser. Frank collapsed. His cane clattered onto the street, groceries spilled, and Duke onlookers were horrified. A woman screamed, "He's blind!" Others pulled out their phones, but the damage was done. Frank, shaking and confused, lay on the asphalt in handcuffs. What those officers didn't know was that Frank Moore wasn't just another elderly man. His name was listed in several military commendations, and by a stroke of fate, a retired colonel had witnessed everything from a nearby cafe and made a call. 7 minutes later, the first Humvee appeared, then two more. Military personnel sealed off the intersection with calm authority. The streets fell silent. Then came General Thomas Avery, 4-star Army commander, stepping into the chaos with fire in his eyes. He knew Frank personally, and he wasn't there for politics. "What offense," he asked coldly, "warranted a taser on a blind veteran?" There was no answer, only shame. General Avery demanded an investigation, ordered reform, and stayed by Frank's because for every veteran like Frank who moves through life quietly, there are still those who remember their sacrifice and will move mountains when one of them is harmed. Franklin "Frank" Moore, 80 years old and blind, had spent his life navigating darkness with dignity. But as he lay stunned and trembling on the pavement, his white cane lost, Duke whimpering at his side, what happened next would become the turning point in this harrowing moment of injustice. Bystanders who had seen the entire taser incident began shouted in disbelief, recording with their phones, demanding accountability. Among them was a retired Army colonel seated in a nearby cafe. He, Frank, not just as a fellow veteran, but as a man who had served honorably in operations few civilians even knew existed. Without hesitation, the colonel made a discreet call, not to the local precinct or city hall, but to a direct liaison line at the Regional Joint Military Command. 7 minutes. That's all it took. The hum of sirens was soon drowned by the low, unmistakable roar of military engines. 3 olive-drab Humvees and a light tactical troop carrier roared into the intersection, ignoring the police barricade. Out of the lead, Humvee stepped General Thomas Avery, commander of regional U.S. Army forces. With ribbons gleaming and posture rigid with purpose, Avery marched through the stunned officers and civilians, eyes fixed on Frank. Duke remains by Frank's stretcher, a living symbol of loyalty and calm amid the chaos. Avery's voice cuts through the silence. "Sergeant Kelly," he said to the police supervisor, "report." What followed was a chilling confirmation. Frank Moore, a blind veteran crossing the street legally with his service dog, had been misidentified, ignored, and tasered. General Avery's stare fell upon Officers Miller and Davis. His words were quiet, but razor sharp. What part of protecting the public allows you to assault an unarmed blind man? No one answered, because in that moment, even the most seasoned officers knew they were witnessing something bigger than protocol. They were witnessing what justice looks like when power is used not to control, but to protect the very people who once protected us all. As Frank Moore lay on the stretcher, barely conscious and trembling from the effects of the taser, General Thomas Avery stood over him, not just as a commanding officer, but as a protector of every soldier who had ever worn the uniform. With Duke, Frank's faithful service dog, nestled beside him, the general leaned in gently. "Frank, it's General Avery. You're safe now. We're going to take care of everything," he said softly, his voice holding a rare tenderness. That moment of reassurance was brief, though, as General Avery's gaze quickly shifted toward the two responsible officers, Officer Miller and Officer Davis, who stood stiff and pale a few feet away, realizing the weight of the authority now bearing down on them. General Avery's words, once calm, turned cutting as he addressed Sergeant Kelly, the senior officer on site. "You're telling me this man, blind, elderly, accompanied by a service dog, was tased for trying to cross the street?" His tone leaves no room for excuses. Kelly admitted it was a critical error in judgment, but Avery wasn't interested in prospective language. Turning his glare on Miller and Davis, he delivered a pointed interrogation. "Did either of you identify yourselves? Offer help? Follow your own department's disability protocol?" There was only silence, broken by a weak defense from Miller about Frank's non-compliance. Avery's response was swift and unforgiving. "He's blind. You led him with a loudspeaker, then shot him with 50,000 volts. That's not law enforcement. It's a failure of humanity." The general immediately demanded two investigations, one internal, led by Sergeant Kelly, and a federal inquiry through the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He also ordered the city's mayor and chief of police to meet him at the hospital within the hour to discuss how this department would overhaul its training for handling disabled individuals, especially veterans. As one of his aides handed him a secure phone, he personally flagged the case to Pent. This wasn't just about a single veteran anymore. It was about a systemic failure that had to be confronted. The soldiers under Avery's command stood quietly, but their presence was louder than any siren. And as Frank was lifted into the ambulance, Duke's eyes followed General Avery, loyal, alert, protective, just like every man and woman in uniform who still believed in duty, honor, and accountability. The police department was already scrambling. Sergeant Kelly, Officers Miller and Davis were suspended within hours, their actions now the subject of both departmental review and a federal civil rights inquiry triggered by Avery's call to the Department of Justice. The city's mayor and chief of police met with General Avery at the hospital, emerging from the meeting with grave faces and a list of sweeping reforms. Chief among them was mandatory training for all officers on interacting with individuals with disabilities, especially veterans, including de-escalation procedures and identifying assistive devices such as white canes and service dogs. Meanwhile, Frank's story had spread like wildfire. The incident, caught on multiple cell phones, went viral within hours. Millions watched in disbelief as a blind elderly veteran was tasered in broad daylight while trying to cross a familiar street. Public outrage mounted, and the narrative shifted from one of error to one of systemic failure. Veterans organizations, disability rights groups, and citizens from across the country rallied behind Frank. Messages of support flooded the hospital. Volunteers brought comfort items. Donations poured in to assist with his recovery and to fund Duke's care. But through it all, Frank remained humble. "I didn't ask for attention," he told a hospital social worker. "Just a fair chance to get across the street." And perhaps that's what makes the impact so powerful. One man's ordinary attempt to live with dignity revealed extraordinary cracks in the systems meant to protect him. But it also reminds the nation that heroes like Frank Moore still walk among us, sometimes unseen, but never unworthy of the fiercest defense. Frank Moore's recovery at City General Hospital was quiet, but far from unnoticed. As he rested in his room, the nation outside was still echoing from the aftershocks of what had happened to him. General Thomas Avery privately ensures that Frank received the best possible care. He ordered that Duke, Frank's loyal service dog, be evaluated by a veterinarian and kept close during Frank's recovery. The emotional trauma was still raw. Frank struggled with flashbacks of the shouting, the sudden pain, and the helplessness of collapsing into a world that had always relied on sound and trust. But Frank was never alone. The veterans community showed up in full force. Former service members, some who'd never met Frank, visited or sent letters of support. His hospital room overflowed with cards, handshakes, and quiet salutes. It was their way of saying, "We saw, we won't forget." The retired colonel, who had made the urgent call that triggered the military response, visited Frank regularly, sometimes just to sit in silence beside him. Outside, Officers Miller and Davis faced intense scrutiny. Their suspension had evolved into potential termination pending the results of ongoing investigations. Sergeant Kelly fully cooperated, opening up records and body cam footage to federal authorities. Meanwhile, the department launched a fast-tracked overhaul of its training procedures. Disability awareness modules were no longer optional. They became mandatory. Each officer will now be evaluated on their understanding of proper protocol for interacting with veterans and individuals with disabilities. Frank's name was placed at the center of the new training, his story now a cautionary tale. General Avery also didn't stop at reprimands. He lobbied city officials to launch a permanent civilian oversight committee with representations from veterans organizations. His point was firm. Systemic trust had been breached, and veterans like Frank needed advocates inside the walls of power, not just outside them. As the days passed, Frank's strength slowly returned. He resumed reading audiobooks, petting Duke, and listening to news stories covering his incident, yet he never expressed bitterness. "I've been through worse," he'd tell visitors with a soft smile, "but maybe this time the lesson sticks." Because of Frank, laws would change, training will improve, and most importantly, for every man or woman who bore the invisible scars of service, one blind veteran had made sure they were a little more visible than before. After the chaos settled and Frank Moore was released from the hospital, the city began to heal, but not forgotten. Thanks to General Thomas Avery's firm intervention and the retired colonel's timely call, real change took root. City Hall, under public pressure and military scrutiny, implemented mandatory reforms in law enforcement training. A new division was created within the police depot. Frank Moore's journey teaches us that resilience doesn't always roar. It sometimes speaks softly through calm resolve and quiet dignity. Frank didn't demand the world bend for him. He simply asked for respect. And when that was denied, his courage ignited a movement. His story reminds us all, behind every disability is a person with untold strength. Behind every uniform, be it military or police, must be empathy, not just authority. If this story moved you, leave a comment honoring veterans like Frank and share a time when you saw justice done right. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful, real-life stories that show the strength of character, the importance of accountability, and the heroes who,